All right, let's try it now. There we go. Got it. And when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days sing God's praise than when we first begun. It would be neat to be able to sing and your voice not give out singing because you sing so long. If you will, turn over to Genesis, and I don't know whether you want to try to follow me along in all of this or not. I've not necessarily really got a lot of reading. I'm reading some points as I'm going to be going through some chapters. But just a brief little history, and some may know this story very, very, very well. And there may be others who don't know it quite so well. And there may be some that have never even heard it before. I don't know where you're at. But I want us to look at the story of Joseph together. The basic story of Joseph. Now, if you don't know who Joseph was, we're not talking about Mary's husband Joseph when Jesus was born, but going back in time to the blessing of Abraham's family, that he was going to bring about through Abraham a nation of people. And through that nation of people was going to bring one seed who would bless all families of the earth. The promise that he made to Abraham to start with. And you start following that seed line as it goes down through history. And you have, of course, Isaac being born, and then Jacob and Esau. And Jacob ended up having 12 sons. And to his wife Rachel, 2 sons were born, and this is in chapter 35 of Genesis, and I believe it's 24, and that was Joseph and Benjamin. Joseph was born very late in Jacob's life, and of course Benjamin was then born later on. But as we see Joseph, we see a man who was loved dearly by his father because Rachel hadn't had any kids yet, and finally she had Joseph, and this was really something special to Jacob. And it actually says something in this, maybe some of the turmoil that we see happening early on in Joseph's life even may have happened because of this. It says Jacob loved him more than he loved the rest of them because he was a child of his old age. And of course you got to think about Benjamin, but at this point, Benjamin maybe not even being on the scene yet, because everything isn't necessarily in chronological order. Sometimes the way it's written, it'll give the family line, and then it will tell stories that will go back into that family line. But what we see in chapter 37 is that when Joseph was 17 years old, he was helping to pasture the flock, and he saw some things coming from, and you have to know, and not trying to avoid this in any way, but all those 12 sons weren't born by the same woman. Jacob ended up having 2 wives, and that's a story of Jacob, and that's a whole nother story that is very interesting in and of itself. But he ended up having 2 wives, kind of getting cheated by his father-in-law, and they were sisters. But they started kind of battling back and forth as to see who was most important to Jacob and all of this. And so they actually gave their handmaids to him and said, here, have children with them. And so that's how he ended up with 12 kids. And Joseph, at this point, saw some things happening with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. That was the 2 handmaids that had been given. And so, if you want to go back into chapter 35 and look at all those, you find it was Dan and Naphtali and Gad and Asher. These evidently were doing some things that Joseph came back to his dad, and he says, they're not doing right out there. There's some things that they're not really taking care of that they should be or whatever. He gave a bad report to his father, and they absolutely hated him over this. And Joseph, as I've mentioned, was a favorite of Jacob's, and so he made him, and depending upon your translation here, our oldest understanding is that it was a coat of many colors. There's been songs written about it and everything else, and we learn as kids sometimes coming up in Bible classes that he made him this coat of many colors. Some translations may actually just say an extra long tunic. depending upon the translation of the word there, or vari-collared tunic that he would have had. But it was something special that he had, and so it just distanced him all that much more from his brothers. He was giving bad reports on some of them, and he was a favorite of his father, and so he was treated pretty bad. And then, to top things off, he had a dream. And he told the dream to his brothers, and they hated him that much more. He had a dream that there were sheaves in the field. They were binding up the sheaves in the field. And he says, my sheaf rose up and stood up, and your sheaves gathered around mine, and they bowed down to my sheaf. Now, if they're putting these things together in the field, and Joseph's doing his, and all of a sudden, I mean, it stands up, and all the rest of them get around, and they bow down. I mean, sounds like a dream, doesn't it? I mean, we can dream some crazy things sometimes. And sometimes it's enjoyable, and sometimes it's not. But he's telling his brothers this dream, and they're thinking, you're going to rule over us, are you? And they just hated him that much more. And then he had another dream, and it says he saw the sun and the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. So it's not just the sheaf now, but he's saying they were all bowing down to me. Well, they, of course, get upset about it, and you think we're going to all serve you. And even Jacob, his father, talks to him about that. He says, are your mother and myself and your brothers going to bow down to you? Is that what you think this means? And he kind of rebukes him for this just a little bit. But it says that Jacob holds this thought. He kind of remembers it. He listens to what he says, and even though he kind of gets on to him for it, he puts this back in his memory. Well, he's going to send Joseph to his brothers. They had gone to Shechem, and they would go in various places and pasture the flocks, and they were gone, and so he's going to send Joseph to check on them and then come back and give a report how the brothers are doing. And so he goes looking for them, can't find them at first. They've moved, and so he has to go a little bit further, and they see him coming. Now, keep in mind, all these things that have happened this far, that they don't like Jacob at all. And there's a lot of things that go on with these men, and when you think about the 12 tribes of Israel, and of course the merging of a tribe there, and later on what happens with Joseph's sons and that kind of thing, but you think about, well, they must have been upstanding people and really good. There was a lot of things that went on in their lives that it just wasn't so good. And yet God was doing something. But here they saw Joseph coming from a distance, and it says they plotted against him. And I'm in if you're trying to follow this, I'm in chapter 38 and verse 18. They plotted against him to put him to death. So now all the brothers aren't in on this, and we're going to see that. All the brothers aren't in on this, not yet. But they see him coming, and so they're going to kill him. And then they just plan to throw him into one of the pits. These pits, evidently, I mean, they would dig wells, and sometimes the wells didn't work. I mean, they didn't hit water, and so there were these pits that were in various places in the ground. It mentions later on about the pit didn't have any water in it, but they said, we can kill him, we can throw him into one of these pits. Wild beasts will eat him up, and we'll be good, and that's what we can tell Dad. Wild beast got him. Well, Reuben hears this, and so he's not part of that discussion, but he heard it, and he rescued them out of their hands, and by saying, let's not take his life. Let's not do that. Instead, we can put him into one of these pits, and we can just leave him there. And that way, you guys aren't guilty of murder. You haven't killed your brother. We'll just put him in one of these pits. And Reuben's thinking, I can come back later and I can save him. And so he's trying to trick his brothers with this, and so when Joseph gets there, why he's convinced them, at least to that point, right now, and so they strip him of his tunic and they throw him in the pit. It says they sit down to eat lunch. Kind of sounds like a bunch of brothers, doesn't it? They've got Joseph in the pit, and they're sitting up there eating lunch. I watched a guy one time that was trying to get out of a sinkhole. We were all down in a big sinkhole. Guys, don't do this, okay? Uh, we were all down in a big sinkhole, and he was really having a hard time getting out. We had a rope that we had to climb up and get out of there, and he was having a hard time getting out. His cousin had shown up. He came down, and he didn't stay very long. He climbed back up, but his cousin was up there, and he said, "You know what?" He said, "Since you're having a hard time," and I was next to the last one out, and I went in and crawled out. He said, "Let Brad out," and he said, "We'll just go ahead and tie something you can sit on the rope. You know, just tie a loop in it, and you can kind of sit on it." He said, "I'll hook it to the back of my Jeep, and we'll pull you out." And so that's what started to happen. And, of course, all the rest of us were up top, and he started pulling him up, and it was working. He was pulling him up. But we're talking a fairly deep sinkhole, and it was a big area down in there. He got him about halfway up, and he shut the Jeep off and put the parking brake on. And he said, "So, boys, how you been doing?" You know, he was going to talk for a while. Well, here was Joseph down in the pit, and the brothers sit down to eat. Well, they see some Midianites coming up, and these guys are going to Egypt is where they're going, and they have perfumes and various things like that they're taking to Egypt. They're going to make some money, and so they're headed up there, and what they end up deciding to do is to make some profit off of this, and now Judah gets in on the act. There's already been some things happen with Judah, and there's going to be more things happen with Judah, and he's kind of a colorful character, if you will, but he gets in on this, and he says, "Hey, guys, we can make some money off of this." And he does seem to be thinking about Joseph a little bit, but I'm not sure if he's thinking more about the money or if he's just trying to get Joseph off the hook, that he's not going to, be left in the pit there. He says, "We can sell him. We can sell him as a slave, and these guys will take him on, and we can still tell the same story to Dad that, something's happened to him." And so that's what they end up doing. They sell him. I think it's 20 shekels of silver or something like that. They sell him to these guys, and they head on to Egypt. Well, they take the tunic, and they kill one of the lambs, and they cover it with blood, and they take it back to their father Jacob. And they said, "We're not sure what happened. What do you think happened?" I mean, it seems like they're kind of trying to ease the lying aspect a little bit. And he looks at it, he says, "It's obvious." He said, "This thing's tore up, and it's been ripped off my son. Wild beast has ripped him to shreds. He's gone." He says, "I will go to my grave mourning my son." Well, in the meantime, the Midianites sell Joseph, and this is the last part of chapter 37, in Egypt, to this guy named Potiphar. Potiphar was Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard, so he had a high position. And now Joseph is sold into his home. Well, we see in chapter 38 there's more about Judah and some things that happened with him, but as we get over to chapter 39 of Genesis, it tells us, one first thing it tells us, of course, is the importance of Potiphar, and that Joseph is now owned by him, and he's in his household. But it says in verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph. And so he became a successful man. So you start thinking, okay, he was a slave. How could he be a successful man? Well, Potiphar seen everything that he was doing and the way that he would take care of things. And so he started giving him a little bit more to do. And everything that Joseph did turned out well. And so he put him not only his house, but it says his house and his fields. He put him in charge of. And he said, nothing else, is restricted to you. You are over everything. You're just like me. You're over everything. And so he put him in charge. And it says Potiphar really didn't have to worry anything about coming home except for coming home and eating. And it kind of puts it that way. He didn't have to concern himself with anything. And his household was flourishing. His crops were doing well. Joseph was blessed by God to be able to do very well in these things. Now, it tells us something about Joseph here that it really hasn't told us before in chapter 39, is Joseph was a good-looking man. It says he was handsome. And Potiphar's wife desired Joseph. Now, I don't know how long, it doesn't tell us how long, but it says day after day. It first tells us the first time. She comes to Joseph and she says, "Lie with me." Joseph says, how could I do such a thing? You know, Potiphar has blessed me. How could I sin against, and it's interesting how his answer is there, how could I sin against God in this way? How could I do this? Potiphar, your husband has given me charge over everything. The only thing that is withheld from me is you, and that's because you are his wife. That's what he tells her. And it says day after day, when he comes into the house, she comes to him. Finally, one day, it's just the two of them in the house, and she grabs him by the coat and says, lie with me, and he just leaves it and runs. Well, and you try to get in somebody's head this way, and we really can't do that, but what her thinking was at that point maybe was to save face, because obviously, probably somebody has seen Joseph run, and there's going to be questions about this. So she screams, and she calls the other people into the house, and she says, look what this Hebrew has done to me. He's a foreigner, and he's in this house. Look what he's done. And he's come after me. And I screamed, and so he left his clothes, and he ran. And so she leaves it laying right there until Potiphar gets home, and she just stays put, and she leaves it laying right there, and she tells him the same story. He becomes furious, so he throws him in Pharaoh's jail. And it doesn't say just threw him in jail. It says he has him thrown in Pharaoh's jail. Now, it's an interesting point. Of course, everything that Potiphar would have been over for Pharaoh, captain of the bodyguard and the authority that he would have had, so he could have put him where he wanted to put him. He put him in Pharaoh's jail. Well, there were two other guys in the jail. And by this time, you're thinking, man, Joseph has horrible luck. The things that happened to him. But we got to see the full story of this and see where all this goes. There were two other guys in there, and one was a baker for the king, and the other was a cupbearer for the king. And it's kind of interesting because when Joseph ends up in the prison, I don't know what all they do in Pharaoh's prison, but evidently there's some things that they had them doing. It wasn't work release. They were in the pits, but they were able to evidently be doing some things that Joseph began organizing things in the jail. And he was doing so well that the jailer put everybody underneath Joseph in the jail, and he was taking care of the jail. He was still a prisoner himself. He couldn't go out or anything like that, but he was organizing what was happening in Pharaoh's jail. And you can see how, in each case, as Joseph is excelling here, the other people that are in charge, they can kind of just sit back and watch. You get somebody good that's underneath you, they make you look good. And that's what was happening here. Joseph was good at it. And so the jailer could sit back and this is great. He's doing all the work. I get all the credit, and this is great. So he put everybody else underneath Joseph. Well, these other two guys that were in there, the cupbearer and the baker, they had both offended Pharaoh in some way, and so had thrown him in jail. He sounds like a king, right? Well, they had dreams. And they both had dreams, and it was on the same night that they had these dreams. And Joseph happens to see them, and he says, why are these guys so sad? And so he goes to them, and he says, why are your faces so sad today? They said to him, this is in chapter 40 and verse 8, they said to him, we have had a dream, and there is no one to interpret it. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell it to me, please. Now keep in mind, Joseph has kind of got a history of dreams. He had these dreams himself, and that he must have always wondered about, even from this time on, the time he had them on. But he's saying, don't interpretations belong to God? And so he says, tell me your dreams. So the cupbearer told him, he said, this is my dream. He said, there was a vine in front of me, and the vine had 3 branches, and it started budding and had blossoms on it, and then it had clusters that produced ripe grapes. And it says, now Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, so I took the grapes and I squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. Joseph said, well, here's the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. says, within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head, restore you to your office, and you will put Pharaoh's cup into his hand according to your former custom. He says this to the cupbearer, just one thing, keep me in mind when it happens. This is going to be 3 days. Joseph says, just keep me in mind. Let Pharaoh know about me, that I'm here. I haven't done anything wrong. And yet I'm here. Well, of course, the baker, he wants his told as well. And so he tells his dream. He said, in my dream, there were 3 baskets of white bread on my head. And in the top basket, there was some of all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, and the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. Joseph says, well, here's your interpretation of your dream. It says the 3 baskets are 3 days. Now, you got to think this guy's getting excited now. He said the 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and will hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat flesh off of you. Not so good. Both of these things happened. But the cupbearer didn't think to mention Joseph. He didn't say anything about him. 2 full years went by. And so, the cupbearer wasn't going to say anything, it seemed as. But 2 full years went by, and Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile, and there were 7 cows, sleek and fat, it says, and they grazed in the marsh grass. 7 other cows came up from the Nile, ugly and gaunt, and it says they stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. Then the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows, and Pharaoh woke up. Strange dream. But here's these nice fat cows, and they're up there on the bank. They come up out of the Nile, and then these ugly, skinny cows come up. They're standing by them, and they eat them. What in the world can this mean? Well, Pharaoh fell back asleep, and he had another dream. There were 7 ears of grain that came up on a single stalk, and it says they were plump and good, and then 7 thin, scorched ears sprouted after them, and it says the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. Pharaoh woke up again. He called for his magicians and the people that would hopefully know what this meant, and nobody could interpret Pharaoh's dream. And the chief cupbearer goes, oh, there is this guy and he has to tell a little bit about his story. He says I was out of your favor, and you had put me in the jail, and you also put the baker in the jail, and there was this guy. We both had dreams, and he told us the interpretation of the dreams, and it happened. I'm back as your cupbearer. You killed the baker. It happened. And so Pharaoh sends, and he calls for Joseph, and it says they hurriedly get Joseph out, and they clean him up. It tells you a little bit probably what the jail was like. They clean him up, put new clothes on him, and they send him before Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, I've heard it said about you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph then answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. And so Pharaoh goes ahead to describe all of what he's dreamed, those 2 dreams. Joseph says to Pharaoh, the dreams are one and the same. The dreams that you've dreamed, they mean exactly the same thing. There are going to be 7 years, 7 good years. These are the 7 good-looking cows that come up out of the Nile. There are going to be 7 really good years. But then after those 7 years, the east wind is going to blow. It's going to dry everything up, and there are going to be 7 years that are horrible. And drought is going to happen. People are going to starve, and the famine is going to come. So he says, here's what you need to do, Pharaoh. You need to find a man that is wise and discerning, and you need to put him in charge and start charging a 5% tax on all grain. And while these good years are happening, that there's lots of produce and an abundance, rather than consuming all that or selling all of that off, he needs to start storing it back. Well, of course, after he describes all this, Pharaoh looks at his advisors and all these people, and he says, who is there wiser than this guy that can interpret my dream and tell me what to do following this? It's obvious God is with him. And so he puts Pharaoh in charge, or he puts Joseph in charge of everything. And it's the same kind of thing as in Potiphar's house. He says, there is nothing besides my throne that is not underneath you. You are second only to me, and there is nothing that I'm withholding from you. You are in charge of it all. And so Joseph begins the process. I mean, they're having these seven good years, and he begins this process. He is now 30 years old. Remember, we picked up on the story when he was 17, when he went out to his brothers. All those years have passed. He's 30 years old. Well, what happens is the 7 years go by, and then the 7 years of drought happen. The 7 years of drought hit the Hebrew people hard. And Jacob is going to send his sons up, and he's going to send them up to Egypt, and they need to get some grain. Well, they go up there, and there's Joseph. They don't recognize him, but he recognizes them. And he says, why have you come here? You are spies. And it actually says that he has to go out of the room and because he weeps. And this happens more than once in this circumstance between him and his brothers not knowing who he is, and he goes out and he hides himself and he cries and he says, you're spies. You've come to spy out the land to see what's vulnerable. And they said, no, we're not spies. We're honest, good men. Yeah, that's what they say. We're honest, good men. And there's 12 sons of our father, and he's getting old. And of course, you got to be thinking what must be going through Joseph's mind at this time. But he ends up, when he sends them away, he says, load them down with the grain, but put the money back in their bags. And he doesn't tell them that. But when they get a ways out, I mean, one of them is getting ready for some water or something like that, and he opens the bag, and there's the money, and they're like, what has happened? And they're scared. I mean, this ruler, they've talked to this ruler of Egypt who is over everything, and now here they've gone away, and there's money. They don't know, do we take it back? Do we keep it? What do we do? They get home. They get ready to tell Jacob about this stuff, and they've all got their money in their bags. And so they eat up what they've got, and Jacob says, you've got to go back. And they said, well, what about the money situation? He said, take it all back and take a second amount of money with you, because it may have just been a mistake. And, you know, he's wise enough to know. I mean, they could all be thrown in prison if this was stolen. And so he sends them back. And they go back, and they've been talking to Joseph this first time up about there's 12 sons, and their father's old. And so he gets to questioning them about Benjamin, the youngest. He said, you said you had a younger brother, you know, and they've already told him that one brother is dead, which they think he is, and he's not. He's standing there talking to them. But he finds out about Benjamin, and asks about their father, and is he still alive, and all of that. And he ends up saying he wants to see this younger son. And it ends up that he keeps Simeon there. And he sends him back down. Jacob says, no way. My son Joseph is already gone. Am I going to be bereaved for my other young son, Benjamin, now as well? No, it's not going to happen. Well, they eat all the food, and they're hungry again. And finally Jacob says, okay, you can take him, go. And so it's been all this time. Simeon's been sitting up there in jail. And so they go back up. Well, as the story goes, when they come this time, Joseph can't hold it in. He breaks down, and he cries, and he sends everybody out. Of course, they're standing there looking, and they don't understand all this. And there's two or three other things that happen in here that I'm not covering. But when they're back in the presence with Jacob here, and when he actually sends them out and they come back, I mean, he plants a cup in Benjamin's his cup, silver cup that he drinks from, plants it in his donkey, and he ends up, I mean, he's gonna arrest him and all of this, and they have to come back. So all of this happens because Judah just, he says, our father is old. he's been mourning the death of our brother all of these years, and this can't happen to this our other younger one. And that's the point that Joseph just explodes. And he sends everybody else out, and only the brothers are in there. And it says he weeps so loud that even Pharaoh's house hears him. Everybody hears, everybody outside, they hear him weeping and mourning over what's happened. And he tells these brothers who he is. And he has to tell them again who he is. He said, I am Joseph. I am your brother. And of course, they're scared at first. And he starts treating them well. And he says, I want you to go down and get my father and bring him back. Well, when Pharaoh heard of this, before they ever go back down, Pharaoh says, here's what's going to happen. You see that land over there? It's the best land we have. That's going to be your families. I'm going to give it to you. You have your father come up. Just bring everybody up. And he says, just don't worry about bringing all your goods and things up here with you. Leave them there. I'm going to give you the best of everything we've got. And so here comes the family, and they all come up into Egypt, and Joseph, throughout all of this, ends up treating his brothers very well. And he talks to them about the fact that, yes, you did this to me, but God was blessing me all along. When Jacob finally dies, I think it's 12 years later, I mean, all this time has passed, and Joseph has treated them very well. But when Jacob dies, they get scared again. They think, well, he just did this for our father. Now what's he going to do to us? Now we're talking about grown men that have their own families and all of this, but now they're afraid. Well, he just treated us good because of Dad. Now what is it going to be? Now what's going to happen? And when Joseph learns of it and he sees that they're afraid, they think that he's holding a grudge, he makes a statement. And it's in chapter 50, in verse 19. It says, but Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. Don't be afraid. Am I God that I would do this? You meant it for evil against me, but God meant it for good. In John chapter 11, in the New Testament, not necessarily one of those passages that always just stand out. But beginning in verse 47, talking about Jesus, it says, therefore the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council and were saying, what are we doing? For this man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was a high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die for the people and that the whole nation not perish? Now he did not say this on his own initiative, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation. And not for the nation only, but in order that he might also gather together into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on, they planned together to kill him. They meant it for evil. Caiaphas meant what he said for evil. They're saying, what are we doing? What are we going to do? This man is getting more popular all the time. If we don't do something, then everybody's going to follow him. The Romans are going to come. They're going to take away our nation. They're going to take away our portion of the government. We won't be in charge anymore, like they were ever in charge. And Caiaphas stands up and he says, don't you get it? It's worth it for one man to die so that all of us don't have to go through this. He meant that for evil. But you know what it said? And it's amazing because this is Caiaphas. This is the guy that ultimately issued the death blow within all of his power that he had. Of course, it was going to take Pilate. But this is Caiaphas. And it says, but he was high priest. And even if he didn't know it, he was prophesying that, yes, one man was going to die to bring all of God's people together. They meant it for evil. God meant it for good. One more passage. 1 Peter chapter 4. If you guys want to come on up, you can. Verse 12 says this, Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you. But to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that also at the revelation of his glory you may rejoice with exultation. If you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rest on you. Make sure that none of you suffers as a murderer, or thief, or evildoer, or troublesome meddler. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed, but is to glorify God in his name. In this life, there will be things that are going to happen to you that they mean it for evil. But let it be known that as much as it was true with Joseph, as much as it was true with Jesus, it is true with you as well. If they mean it for evil, God means it for good. Verse 19, Therefore those also who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right. Don't lose heart. If in some way you need to respond to this, come as we stand and sing together.